This move immediately seizes control of the central squares and opens diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, setting the stage for dynamic central play and potential pawn advancements. This move, 1, e5, directly challenges white's central pawn, mirroring white's initial claim on the board and aiming to achieve a balanced pawn center and open lines for piece development. This move develops a knight towards the center, attacking black's pawn on e5 and preparing to castle, which is a fundamental principle of opening play. This move, known as the Petrov's defense, immediately challenges white's central pawn and knight, initiating an aggressive and often symmetrical battle for control of the center. This move initiates the Petrov's defense, where white accepts a pawn sacrifice to potentially gain a developmental advantage by attacking black's advanced central pawn. This move, developing the queen's pawn, is the main line of the Petrov defense, aiming to challenge white's central pawn and free the bishop on c8. This move, retreating the knight to f3, maintains pressure on the d4 square and prepares for potential pawn advances in the center, rather than recapturing the pawn immediately. This move challenges white's advanced knight, aiming to regain the pawn sacrificed earlier in the Petrov defense and recover material equality. This move reinforces the central pawn tension, aiming to regain the sacrificed material while challenging black's control of the e4 square. This move reinforces the center and prepares to challenge white's central pawn structure, typical of Petrov defense lines aiming for a solid, symmetrical position. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, preparing to castle and support the central pawn structure against black's initiative. This move is crucial for developing the bishop actively and challenging white's central control by preparing to recapture on e4 if possible. Castling kingside achieves a fundamental opening goal by securing the king and connecting the rooks, preparing for central pawn breaks and active piece play. With castling, black secures their king and prepares to connect their rooks, a standard developing maneuver in this symmetrical variation of the four knights game. This move initiates a central pawn struggle, aiming to seize space and potentially break open lines for white's pieces. This developing move prepares to castle kingside while reinforcing the central d5 pawn and creating a solid pawn chain. This move centralizes the rook, preparing to contest the open e-file and potentially support a future d4-d5 pawn push. This move signals black's intention to aggressively challenge white's central pawn structure and gain space on the kingside, potentially preparing to launch an attack. This pawn push strategically restricts black's kingside development and prepares to build a powerful pawn chain by advancing the b-pawn, gaining central space and initiative. Developing the bishop to e7 supports the pawn on d5 and prepares to castle kingside, solidifying black's defensive structure after white's aggressive pawn push to c5. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, challenging black's central pawn control and preparing for potential tactical skirmishes in the center. This move actively repositions the knight to a more central square, preparing to contest white's knight on e5 and potentially reinforce the d6 pawn. The capture on d7 simplifies the position and resolves white's minor piece structure issues, but it allows black to recapture with their queen, potentially activating it. This recapture on d7 is crucial for black as it opens the bishop's diagonal and aims to challenge white's central pawn control while preparing for future development. This move prepares to challenge black's central pawn majority and solidify white's kingside by potentially advancing the g-pawn. Developing the knight to f6 provides active defense for the e-pawn and prepares for central Counterplay. Aiming to unbalance white's pawn structure. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to pressure black's d5 pawn and potentially create threats on the kingside. This retreat reroutes the knight towards the kingside, preparing to reinforce the f6 square and potentially contest the initiative on the central files. This move offers a pawn sacrifice, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's pieces, creating tactical complications. The move 15, qc8, aims to reroute the queen to a more active square on the queenside, potentially supporting a pawn advance or preparing to challenge white's rooks, which are now aggressively placed on the d-file. This recapture on e5, after black's unexpected rook sacrifice, aims to regain material and activate white's rooks on the central files, preparing to challenge black's queen. This move, 16, bf6, aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square where it can potentially support a kingside pawn advance or challenge white's pieces. This move forces black's bishop to abandon its defensive post on e7, allowing white to gain tempo and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king. This move tucks the king away from the now potentially open diagonal and prepares for the pawn push. g6, reinforcing the kingside and allowing the f8 bishop to move. This move repositions the rook to a more active file and prepares to challenge black's advanced pawn structure. This move prepares to defend the d6 pawn and potentially challenge white's dominant knight on e5 by offering a pawn exchange. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to exchange it for black's well-placed knight and thereby weaken black's kingside pawn structure. This move initiates counterplay on the queenside, challenging white's pawn chain and potentially opening lines for black's rook and bishop. This move, nc3, solidifies white's central control and prepares to challenge black's somewhat passive bishop on e7, by potentially aiming for the d5 pawn. This knight maneuver aims to reposition the piece to the more active c7 square, supporting the eventual c5 pawn push and preparing to contest the d5 square while also potentially eyeing the b5 square. The queen's move to d3 prepares to potentially support an advance on the kingside or centralize the queen for increased activity in the coming middle game. This move develops the rook to an active central file, aiming to contest control of the open d-file and potentially support a pawn push on the queenside. Bringing the other rook to the central file increases pressure on black's position and prepares for potential breakthroughs along the e-file or d-file. This capture on c5 is a critical decision, as it opens the b-file for black's rook and creates doubled c-pawns for white, potentially weakening white's pawn structure. This capture opens the d-file and creates potential for the queen and rooks to become active, while also addressing the pawn structure by reducing black's central control. This move, nb5, repositions the knight to pressure white's c3 knight and potentially disrupt white's queenside pawn structure, while also preparing to exploit the open c-file if it can be controlled. By exchanging the bishop for the knight, white aims to dismantle black's pawn structure and open up lines for their rook and queen against the weakened kingside. The capture on b5 opens the c-file for black's rook and aims to create counterplay on the queenside by leveraging the now passed c-pawn. The move bd6 aims to activate the bishop, control the central dark squares, and prepare for potential sacrifices or exchanges that could simplify the position and improve white's piece activity. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the c-file and potentially support a queenside pawn advance. This move initiates a strong central pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and create attacking possibilities on the kingside. This exchange simplifies the position, removing black's active bishop and accepting a slightly compromised pawn structure in exchange for potentially easier piece play. Recapturing the pawn on d5 offers white a more active rook and centralizes the queen, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares on black's kingside. This move prepares to contest the vital open c-file, aiming to develop the kingside pawn structure and prevent white's centralized knight from dominating the board. This move unpins the knight and aims to control the 7th rank, potentially creating mating threats against black's king while disrupting black's coordination. This move offers a timely defense of the rook on d7, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially challenge white's active pieces. This exchange removes a key defender of black's kingside and opens up the d-file for white's rooks, potentially leading to a decisive attack.